So, last December when we left to go back to the States for the holidays to be with our family, I knew that when we came back that the time was going to be short. I knew that I was going to be called upon to preach quite a lot because Pastor Ross was no longer here. And as I thought about all this, I began thinking about what would I really like to preach about during these remaining weeks. Because like Pastor James and Pastor Ross, I too really want what I have to share with you to be important to you. There's a song that has become very meaningful to me and my wife during our ministry. It's a song that is called, "Will You Love Jesus More?" And there's a group called Phillips, Craig, and Dean. So if you want, you can go to YouTube and just type in "Will You Love Jesus More" by Phillips, Craig, and Dean, and you can just watch them sing it. It's an amazing song. The words have spoken deeply, deeply to us. Let me just give you the words of the first verse and the chorus. "I feel quite sure if I did my best, I could maybe impress you with tender words and a harmony and a clever rhyme or two. But if all I've done in the time we've shared is turn your eyes on me, then I've failed at what I've been called to do. There's someone else I want you to see. Will you love Jesus more when we go our different ways? When this moment is a memory, will you remember his face? Will you look back and realize you sensed his love more than you did before? I pray for nothing less than for you to love Jesus more." That song, those words are just so meaningful because our time is coming to an end. We are leaving. And when you realize that we're leaving, what is it that you are going to be thinking about? I hope it's not me. I hope it's not my wife. Well, on her case, I can. But I hope it's Jesus. I hope it's Jesus that you remember. I've also been drawn to a couple of verses in 1 Corinthians chapter 2. 1 Corinthians chapter 2 says, "And when I came to you, brothers, I did not come proclaiming to you the testimony of God with lofty speech or wisdom, for I decided to know nothing among you except Jesus Christ and him crucified." So for today, and the next several times that I'll be preaching here, I'm going to focus on Jesus. There is much theology and doctrine regarding Jesus. In fact, the whole Bible really points you to Jesus. You can be preaching out of the Old Testament and it points to Jesus. And that's our job as ministers, is to point you in that direction. If you want to discuss salvation, the exclusivity of Christ, then what Jesus said and what others said about him are very, very important. John 14:6, Jesus said to them, "I am the way and the truth and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me." Jesus is important because there is no way, no other path than through Jesus. Today I'm going to preach on Jesus, the light of the world, from John 9. When Jesus used the phrase light of the world, there's a great deal of meaning that goes into that phrase. I'm going to do most of my teaching from John chapter 9, even though Jesus actually used that phrase first in John 8, just after he had forgiven a woman caught in adultery. In John 8:12, he says, "I am the light of the world. Whoever follows me will never walk in darkness, but will have the light of life." For those of you who were with us on Thursday night at our Bible study in Nice, you know we were discussing Philippians chapter 2. And in Philippians chapter 2, I believe it's verse 14, I don't recall exactly, but it says that we believers are referred to as being the light of the world. And this is closely related to what Jesus is saying here. You see, in the Bible, we are confronted with the image of light and darkness. In fact, the very first thing created, Genesis chapter 1, verse 3, and God said, "Let there be light." And it was good. Theologically speaking, light represents good, and the opposite of that, darkness, represents bad or evil. One can create light in a variety of ways. You can turn a switch. Well, the lights come on. You've created a little bit of light. You can light a candle. Okay? You can do that. But one cannot create darkness. One cannot create darkness. To get darkness, you have to seal out the light. You have to make sure the light does not shine in. Darkness is the absence of light. Like I already mentioned, we as believers are called to be lights in this world. We are to shine in dark places, showing good through grace and mercy and love and kindness and gentleness and patience. Everything that the world says we're supposed to do, right? Not really. In John 9, our scripture passage for today, we have the account of the miracle of Jesus healing a man who was born blind. Just before he actually performs this miraculous healing, Jesus states in verse 5, "While I am in the world, I am the light of the world." In both John 8 and 9, light is used to contrast with darkness. And in the second passage, it is specifically the darkness that is caused by physical blindness. Today I have four questions for us to answer that will help us with the application of this passage. The first, just what does it mean to us that Jesus is the light of the world? What does that mean? Second, what are some causes of spiritual blindness? Third, who was Jesus insinuating was blind in this passage? And fourth, how should that affect us as followers of Jesus? So let's open up our Bibles to John chapter 9, and we're going to read the first 7 verses. I'm going to take this just short section by section, and we'll talk about that. John chapter 9, verses 1 to 7. As he passed by. Isn't that a fascinating way to start? As he passed by. He saw a man blind from birth. And his disciples asked him, "Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind?" Jesus answered, "It was not that this man sinned or his parents, but that the works of God might be displayed in him. We must work the works of him who sent me while it is day. Night is coming when no one can work. As long as I am in the world, I am the light of the world." Having said these things, he spit on the ground and made mud with the saliva. Then he anointed the man's eyes with the mud and said to him, "Go wash in the pool of Siloam," which means sent. So he went and washed and came back seeing. The prophet Isaiah wrote that the Messiah would open the eyes of the blind. Isaiah 42:7. He says that when the Messiah comes, he will open the eyes that are blind, to free captives from prison and to release from the dungeon those who sit in darkness. So this is talking about spiritual blindness here. If you are blind, that means that you are a captive, that you are in prison, that you are in dungeon, all of that. So in our passage for today, we have the accomplishment of this prophecy from Isaiah. This passage in John teaches us that there are many different types of blindness to which Jesus is the cure. So my first point to you this morning is people who have judgmental attitudes are blind. People who have judgmental attitudes are blind. What did the disciples say when they walked up to this man? Verse 2, Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? I want to point out that they were convinced that someone had definitely sinned and that the blind man, was naturally suffering because of that sin. From the book of Job, we know that this is exactly what Job's friends thought of Job when God allowed Satan to test Job. In fact, most of the book is his friends trying to get Job to admit that he had sinned. They were convinced of that. This type of thinking was and still is very common thinking by many people. They think that everything that happens to people is a direct result of their actions. If you do good things and do them well, you will be blessed and be rewarded. But if you do bad, you will suffer the consequences. People refer to this as karma. Karma is tied very closely to reincarnation and is prominent in the teachings of Hinduism and Buddhism and Jainism and Sikhism and Taoism and Shintoism and other Eastern religions. But it is not tied to Christianity. This passage shows us that this kind of thinking was not only found in ancient India, because the disciples believed it too. With this type of thinking, one believes that calamity or misfortune is due to a person's sins. Either the individual suffering the calamity has sinned, or someone very near him, such as a close relative like his parents, have sinned. The logical thought process of this thinking is, if things are going well for you, then you must be all right with God. But if something is going wrong in your life, then there must be sin somewhere. Just a little side note here. Let me briefly say something about the wisdom books of the Bible, like Job and Psalms and Proverbs and Ecclesiastes. There have been times I have heard passages from these books misapplied because the one who is doing the speaking does not understand Hebrew wisdom literature. Basically, Hebrew wisdom literature is to be read like general guidelines for our lives, but not literal promises. In other words, they say what will usually happen if one is following their teachings, but not necessarily always. The doctrine of suffering tells us that there can always be exceptions for people's actions, and therefore these teachings should not be taken as a promise. Let me give you an example of that. In Proverbs we read, "Train up a child in the way he should go, and when he is old, he will not depart from it." That is not necessarily true. Generally speaking, it is true. Generally speaking. But I know from personal experience too many children who have gone a different way when they became older. There are times when it is so easy for us to judge others, especially when we know that someone is suffering the direct consequences of their actions. When we hear of a man who was a practicing homosexual and that now he is dying from AIDS, do we say that he deserves what he is getting? When we see a teenage mother who is struggling raising her child by herself, do we justify our inaction by saying she should have waited until she got married to have sex? When we see a person who is suffering from a life of alcoholism, do we turn away from them thinking that they don't deserve any better? It is so much easier for us to sit back and debate the theological ramifications of bad decisions that other humans have made than to show Christian love toward them. It is much easier for us to judge others than to become implicated in their life. Yes, there are some physical consequences of certain actions, but instead of condemning others, we should be instruments of healing and compassion. Remember, we are all sinners in God's sight, and we are all guilty and deserving nothing but eternal punishment, except for the grace of Christ on the cross and the mercy that God shows to us. Jesus' disciples were blinded by a judgmental attitude like what I've just mentioned. Jesus corrects this misunderstanding by saying in verse 3, "It was not that this man sinned or his parents, but that the works of God might be displayed in him." This should give us a very clear idea of how we should act when hard things come into our lives or into the lives of our friends. Bad things can and do happen to good Christian, godly people. Life happens. We get flat tires on our cars like everyone else. Let's be careful before judging others. We should ask ourselves when something happens, God, what are you trying to teach me? I want us to look a little further in our text. So now let's read from verse 8 to verse 12. Verse 8 to verse 12. The neighbors and those who had seen him before as a beggar were saying, "Is this not the man who used to sit and beg?" Some said, "It is he." Others said, "No, but he is like him." He kept saying, "I am the man." So they said to him, "Then how were your eyes opened?" He answered, "The man called Jesus made mud and anointed my eyes and said to me, 'Go to Siloam and wash.' So I went and washed and received my sight." They said to him, "Where is he?" He said, "I do not know." The second thing that I want to tell you this morning is people who let criticism control their beliefs are blind. Not criticism, skepticism. People who let skepticism control their beliefs are blind. From Wikipedia, and I know you can't really always trust Wikipedia, but in Wikipedia we read that skepticism is loosely used to denote any questioning attitude. It's not necessarily bad to be a skeptic. Just because everyone is doing something doesn't mean that it's right. It's okay to question, but we need to be questioning in the right manner. In religion, skepticism refers to a doubt concerning basic religious principles, such as immortality. How can we believe in immortality? Or providence, God already knows. And revelation, God speaks to me? Yes, yes, and yes. When the blind man returned to his home, his neighbors were very skeptical of what they saw. They couldn't even agree that it was the same person. They remembered a man who was blind and begging at the temple, and now he was walking around. How many of us believe in the power of God? Can God perform miracles today? Can he still heal the sick and even raise the dead back to life? Yes. But if we were to meet someone who had been the recipient of this type of God's power, what would we think? Would we be any different than the neighbors of this man? This man's neighbors saw the result of God's power, but they didn't believe. This is what I refer to as being a dishonest skeptic. a dishonest skeptic. They were face to face with irrefutable evidence of God's power. This skepticism made them blind, and they refused to believe. No, this isn't him. This is someone else. We should never be skeptical of God's power or of the power of his message. Let's read a bit further, and this time we're going to read two different sections. First of all, 13 to 17, and then we're going to skip down to verse 24. 13 to 17. They brought to the Pharisees the man who had formerly been blind. Now it was the Sabbath day when Jesus made the mud and opened his eyes. So the Pharisees again asked him how he had received his sight. And he said to them, "He put mud on my eyes, and I washed, and I see." Some of the Pharisees said, "This man is not from God, for he does not keep the Sabbath." But others said, "How can a man who is a sinner do such signs?" And there was a division among them. So they said again to the blind man, "What do you say about him, since he has opened your eyes?" He said, "He is a prophet." He is a prophet. And now skip down to verse 24, and we'll go to 34. 24 to 34. So for the second time they called the man who had been blind and said to him, "Give glory to God. We know that this man is a sinner." He answered, "Whether he is a sinner, I do not know. One thing I do know, that though I was blind, now I see." They said to him, "What did he do to you? How did he open your eyes?" He answered them, "I have told you already, and you would not listen. Why do you want to hear it again? Do you also want to become his disciples?" And they reviled him, saying, "You are his disciples, but we are disciples of Moses. We know that God has spoken to Moses, but as for this man, we do not know where he comes from." The man answered, "Why, this is an amazing thing. You do not know where he comes from, and yet he opened my eyes. We know that God does not listen to sinners, but if anyone is a worshiper of God and does his will, God listens to him. Never since the world began has it been heard that anyone opened the eyes of a man born blind. If this man were not from God, he could do nothing." They answered him, "You were born in utter sin, and would you teach us?" And they cast him out. They cast him out. The third thing that I want to share about this passage is people who are tied to religious traditions are also blind. People who are tied to religious traditions are also blind. Religion can be seen as a system of beliefs. And to be perfectly honest, almost anything can be labeled as a religion. Religion is being taught in all of our schools, though it's been labeled as humanism. Humanism, taken to its limits, say that man is God, and therefore we need to tolerate every sort of belief, because how can one God, small g, how can one God tell another God, small g, that they are wrong? During the time of Christ, the Pharisees were a group of people who had become the religious leaders of the day. They studied the Old Testament and were supposed to make sure that the scriptures were being obeyed. This ended up being a problem because the Pharisees began to suggest things that the people should do to help them follow these Old Testament teachings. And little by little, these teachings grew and they took on more and more importance. So that by the time of Christ, there was a whole set of traditions that had to be followed if you wanted to follow the Old Testament laws. And many of these traditions actually went against what the Old Testament was teaching. It would be easy for us to sit back and point a finger at the Pharisees for sticking so closely to their traditions and religion and thereby remaining blind to the work of Christ. But are we any different today? Haven't we developed our own set of religious traditions and customs? Don't we have our own style of worship, our own way of celebrating the Lord's Supper, our own sort of accepted dress, our own set of do's and don'ts? that our followers must follow if they want to be true believers? It is a mistake to say, you don't worship or serve God like I do, so you are not of God. Or, you cannot be a Christian unless you look and act and talk and believe like we do. No. Religious traditions cannot save anyone. In fact, religious traditions will actually become a religion unto itself. To the Pharisees, the fact that Jesus performed this miracle on the Sabbath meant that he could not have been sent from God, and definitely could not be the Messiah, because they followed the teaching of God, and they knew that how God's followers were supposed to act and not do any work on the Sabbath. Let me paint a picture for you, an illustration that will help you illustrate this problem of religious traditions. Imagine before you this great big bridge, a high bridge. It's a suspension bridge, and there's one part there where you can actually pay to walk over the top of it. And I remember doing that. I remember paying and walking up to the top, and as I got up to the very top, it was a long ways down to the water, hundreds of feet down. And someone at the very top I saw was getting ready to jump off. And I thought to myself, he wants to commit suicide. No, no, no. And so I yelled at him. I said, don't do it. Don't do it. And he replied to me, nobody loves me. And I said, God loves you. God loves you. Do you believe in God? And he said, yes, I do. And I said, are you a Christian or a Jew? And he said, a Christian. And I said, me too, I'm a Christian. Are you Protestant or a Catholic? And he said, Protestant. And I said, me too. And I said, well, what franchise are you? What denomination are you? And he said, I'm Baptist. And I said, me too. And then I said, are you Northern Baptist or Southern Baptist? And he said, I'm Northern Baptist. And I said, me too. And then I said, are you Northern Baptist Conservative or Northern Liberal Baptist? And he said, I'm Northern Conservative Baptist. And I said, me too. And I said, are you Northern Conservative Baptist Great Lakes region or Northern Conservative Baptist Eastern region? And he said, I'm Northern Conservative Baptist Great Lakes region. And I said, me too. And then I said, well, are you Northern Conservative Baptist Great Lakes Region Council of 1879 or Northern Conservative Baptist Great Lakes Region Council of 1912? And he said, I'm actually Northern Conservative Baptist Great Lakes Region Council of 1912. And I said, die, heretic, and I pushed him off. Religious traditions can blind us from God's leading, and sometimes it doesn't make too much to blind us. Let's go back and read the passage about the blind man's parents, which is found in the passage we skipped from verses 18 to 23. Verses 18 to 23. The Jews did not believe that he had been blind and had received his sight until they called the parents of the man who had received his sight and asked them, is this your son who you say was born blind? How then does he now see? His parents answered, we know that that is our son and that he was born blind. But how he now sees, we do not know, nor do we know who opened his eyes. Ask him, he is of age. He will speak for himself. His parents said these things because they feared the Jews. For the Jews had already agreed that if anyone should confess Jesus to be Christ, he was to be put out of the synagogue. Therefore his parents said, he is of age. Ask him. My fourth point is people who fear man more than God are blind. People who fear man more than God are blind. The fear of man instead of God is a fallacy that many people have. When the Pharisees weren't getting the answers that they wanted, they called the blind man's parents. But how did the blind man's parents respond? They wanted no part in this inquisition because they were afraid of what the Pharisees could do to them. Their response was basically giving the minimum possible. Why? Because the Pharisees could kick them out of the synagogue. And we need to remember that this is not the same thing as being kicked out of a church today, where we can just go to another church just around the corner. Being thrown out of the synagogue meant that you were being excommunicated from Jewish society. This not only had religious implications, but also social implications. There would actually be a burial ceremony. And after that, they would be treated as if they were already dead. No one would be allowed to carry on any business with them. None of their future sons could be circumcised. If someone did die, there could be no mourning. No one outside of the close family could show any physical attraction to any of their family. No hugs or slaps or on the back or no brotherly kisses. Nothing. No contact. It's no wonder the parents were afraid. Imagine how torn they would have been. They knew that this was their son and that he was born blind and that for many years they had agonized over the future that their son would have. For those of you who are parents, you know what I'm talking about with your older children. You agonize over their future. And now their son could see. They knew that it had to have been a miracle of some sort. And if their son said that it was this Jesus fellow that had done this miracle, they would have wanted to believe him and rejoice with him. But they were afraid of what men could do to them. Fear can be crippling because it can cause us to do very little or even nothing at all. Fear can also keep us from experiencing the complete work of God in our lives. The Bible is pretty clear as to the type of fear we should have. It's oftentimes referred to as the fear of the Lord. From Psalm 111, verse 10, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. Proverbs 1:7, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. Proverbs 10:27, the fear of the Lord prolongs life. Proverbs 14:27, the fear of the Lord is a fountain of life. Proverbs 19:23, the fear of the Lord leads to life. Jesus said, do not fear those who can kill the body, but cannot kill the soul. Rather, fear him who can destroy both soul and body in hell. What we have seen from this miracle is that there are different types of blindness. Judgmental blindness, you're not like me. Skeptical blindness, science is the only way to truth. I don't care about the proofs of Christianity. Miracles? Ha! The third, traditional religious blindness. Do you believe they don't use the King James Version in this church? I tell you, they even let women use makeup. Fourth, fear-induced blindness, usually caused by man. I know what God says, but what does my mom say? But this isn't the end of the story. This isn't the end of the story. Let's read now, starting in verse 35, going to the end. 35 and going to the end. Jesus heard that they had cast him out, and having found him, he said, do you believe in the Son of Man? He answered, and who is he, sir, that I may believe in him? Jesus said to him, you have seen him, and it is he who is speaking to you. He said, Lord, I believe. And he worshiped him. Jesus said, for judgment I came into this world, that those who do not see may see, and those who see may become blind. Some of the Pharisees near him heard these things and said to him, are we also blind? Jesus said to them, if you were blind, you would have no guilt. But now that you say we see, your guilt remains. This is where we find the teaching of spiritual sight or spiritual blindness. Those who do not believe in the Son of Man are spiritually blind. They are walking in darkness. I find it interesting to notice the progression of belief or spiritual insight that this man, born blind, shows us in his own personal life. In verse 11, we read, he says, the man they called Jesus. Okay, it's still not personal. The man they called Jesus. Verse 17, he is a prophet. Verse 25, whether he is a sinner or not, I do not know. One thing I do know, I was blind, but now I see. Verse 32, nobody has ever heard of opening the eyes of a man born blind. Verse 33, if this man were not from God, he could do nothing. Verse 36, who is the Son of Man, sir? Tell me so that I may believe in him. Verse 38, the man said, Lord, I believe. And he worshiped him. The spiritually blind person that becomes a seeing person is someone who, admitting their helplessness and inability, trusts Jesus for salvation, and God opens their eyes. Those who think they see, but are really trusting in their own self and pride, are actually blind to the wonders and truth about Jesus. But they are the ones who have made themselves blind to the most important things in life. Jesus Christ, the light of the world. It is only Jesus who can help us to see through our judgmental attitudes, through our skepticism, through our own religious traditions, through the fear of man. There's a proverb, not in the Bible, but there's a proverb that says, there is none so blind as he who will not see. Who will not see.